Hello, and welcome to the Election Assistant Commission's training on chain of custody. Thank you for taking the time to complete this training. Let's get started. The goal of this training is to prepare election officials to document the chain of custody of critical election equipment and materials. Here, we will draw on chain of custody practices in other professions to identify what chain of custody is and its importance, and learn how to start and track chain of custody. Then we will discuss how to apply this information to elections, and identify a few simple best practices election officials can use to make sure chain of custody procedures are successfully implemented. This training can be used to establish chain of custody practices or evaluate existing procedures. As in elections, chain of custody is important to many industries: healthcare, environmental sciences, and law enforcement, to name just a few. To identify the basics of chain of custody, we'll look at law enforcement, because the goal of chain of custody in law enforcement and elections is similar. That is, to reinforce the trustworthiness and handling of the items being tracked. Select each button to learn more. When establishing chain of custody, you need to cover what, who, when, and where type questions. Typically, evidence forms assign each item a unique identifier and document: what the item is, when it was collected, who collected it, where it was collected from, and any additional information about who may have been involved. Once the chain of custody is started for a piece of evidence, the key is to maintain it throughout its life cycle. Typically, to maintain the chain, forms must answer who was the item received from, who was the item received by, when did they receive it, and why was it transferred. Filling in these pieces of information each time an item is handled or stored allows the judge or jury to understand where evidence has been and who has possessed it since its collection. And, when properly documented, the form should allow you to reconstruct the movement or storage of an item with no breaks in the chain. In elections, chain of custody is an important piece of the election security puzzle because it shows that items or forms central to elections, like voting equipment, ballots, documentation, poll books, and more, were secured by authorized workers and remain secured. Having evidence or documentation of a complete chain of custody is important whether you are conducting an internal process, like establishing the authenticity of voted ballots prior to an audit or canvass, or during an external legal review if someone contests an election. Now it's time to check your understanding. Read the question and answer choices and select your answer. Then select Submit. One advantage in tracking chain of custody in elections versus law enforcement is that we generally know what type of items we will need to track and can plan for them. Take a few minutes and write down the items your office tracks during an election cycle. Hit pause and restart the video when you are done. Great! Your list likely includes critical equipment and supplies, like electronic voting equipment, ballots, mail ballot envelopes, memory devices or USB drives, poll books or voter lists, and more. For some items, it may be necessary to break them down further. For example, tracking ballots can include subcategories like blank ballot stock, ballots printed for mailing, ballots printed for in-person voting, ballots returned to election officials, including by mail, by drop box, and from voting locations. Those might be both voted and unvoted. Let's look at voting equipment, things like ballot scanners and ballot marking devices, and apply what we've learned from the law enforcement context. For this example, we'll focus on establishing the chain when sending equipment to voting locations and tracking it through its return to storage post-election. It is worth noting that for all election technology, things like voting equipment, electronic poll books, and election management systems, the chain of custody should start whenever you first receive it. Technology should be inventoried, and it should be documented any time office staff or vendors perform acceptance testing, logic and accuracy testing, maintenance, or other actions on it. Inventory and chain of custody may be tracked electronically, on paper, or with a combination of the two. Additionally, we recognize that forms may look different for different items or circumstances. No matter what method you use to track chain of custody for election materials or the design of your forms, The critical information needed remains the same. Returning to our law enforcement example, how can we modify the evidence chain of custody for our voting equipment? In preparing to send voting equipment to locations, the start of the chain should include unique identifiers for each piece of equipment. This might be a serial number or an asset number the election office assigns. Describe the items. Establish the date and time they were prepared. Identify who prepared them for use and where they are held, along with the voting location or precincts it will serve. Additionally, most of the items we track in elections will be secured with tamper evidence seals or locks, so we should also include space to record seal numbers. The next step is to ensure you maintain the chain until the equipment is returned to your office or storage facility. There should be an entry on the chain of custody form anytime items move to or from a location, change hands or oversight, or are unlocked, or unsealed and relocked, or relocked or resealed. On the evidence chain of custody form, we tracked who the item is received from, who received the item, when they received it, and why it was transferred. Take a moment to consider anything that would need to change for election equipment. You may have considered that through the chain, seals and locks need to be verified and, at some point, will likely be broken and replaced. So, we want to make sure we can capture when this happens. To make sure seal verification and replacement can be easily recorded, we can add both to our tracking form. As the equipment is picked up by the delivery team for transportation to the voting location, the delivery team should record an entry in the chain, including verifying seal numbers and signing their names. Once the delivery crew delivers the equipment to the voting location, they can complete an entry reflecting that the seals remain intact and equipment is now stored at the secured voting location. On election morning, poll workers should continue the chain. Again, they should verify seal numbers and record actions taken. For this example, we'll assume workers need to break the tamper evidence seals to prepare the equipment for use. Throughout the day, voters will interact with the equipment. When polls close, poll workers may reseal the equipment in preparation for delivery back to the election office. Then, the delivery crew who picks up the items from the poll workers should complete another entry. Our example will end once the equipment is secured in the election office storage room, with a final entry confirming delivery of the sealed equipment. The specific steps involved in equipment delivery will vary depending on each office's procedures. The important part is to ensure your documentation captures each time equipment moves to or from a location, changes hands or oversight, and is unlocked or unsealed, and relocked or resealed. Ultimately, the information documented should allow you to reconstruct, without any gaps, the movement and storage of the equipment through its use in the election. Now it's time to check your understanding. Read the question and answer choices and select your answer. Then select Submit. Chain of custody practices and forms should be continuously reviewed to improve tracking. Whether you are introducing new forms or looking to update existing forms, consider adopting these 3 practices to support your efforts. Select each button to learn more. First, user test your forms. Before using a new or modified chain of custody form in an election, ask a few of the staff members, temporary workers, or poll workers who will be using it to test it for you. With minimal instruction, give them a simple scenario you'd expect them to be able to document on the form. Have them complete an entry for the scenario. Review their work and see if they were able to complete the form how you expected. And ask simple follow-up questions like, was there anything that was unclear? Or did you have all the information you needed to complete the form? Was there any time you had to guess? Use that feedback to make any adjustments needed prior to using the form in an election cycle. Second, train on chain of custody. Over the course of an election, many staff members, seasonal workers, and poll workers will likely need to complete an entry on a chain of custody. Therefore, it is critical to provide training on how to complete these forms, ideally providing time to practice on the actual forms these workers will use. Training should cover when an entry should be made and the steps you expect these workers to complete, including how to verify seals, report any issues like broken or missing seals, apply new seals, and complete the chain of custody form. Third, after an election, incorporate a review of chain of custody forms into your post-election processes. Chain of custody is one of the many tools we use to secure elections, and this review can help us understand where we may need additional training or adjustments to processes or forms. Congratulations! You have completed the Election Assistance Commission's training on chain of custody for election officials. You should now understand what chain of custody is and its importance, what you need to start and track chain of custody, and how to test and modify chain of custody forms successfully. Now that we have covered the basics of chain of custody, we hope you can use this training to evaluate existing practices or inform new ones. As always, thank you for your work in elections.